Imagine this. August 1664, there's this English fleet looking pretty formidable, anchored just off the Dutch colony of New Amsterdam.
Yeah,
And you've got hundreds of residents just watching, right? Peering across the water, probably wondering if, a huge battle is about to kick off.
absolutely. Terrified it might destroy everything they built, their prosperous lives. It feels like a straightforward conquest story.
Exactly. But what if that story, the one we usually hear, isn't really the full picture? Maybe not even close.
Well, that's what's so fascinating. It's a classic image, isn't it? The powerful arriving to take over. But the reality, which we're diving into today using insights from Russell Shorto's work, it's much more complex and frankly kind of amazing.
And that's our mission for this deep dive, isn't it? To really get into those surprising origins of New York City. We're looking at excerpts that seriously challenge that traditional story. You'll discover how something that looked like, well, an obvious hostile takeover actually became something quite different, something unique.
And what that reveals about the city itself and maybe even the U.S. as a whole. Shorto actually uses the word merger, not conquest.
A merger. That's a powerful reframing.
It really is. And it highlights how, the standard Anglo-centric history often just flattens these complex moments, especially when you've got these huge global empires bumping up against each other.
Right.
Shorto digs right into those often forgotten Dutch roots and this incredibly peaceful handover of power in 17th century North America.
Okay, so let's peel back those layers then. Before the English showed up, what was New Amsterdam really like? What was its character?
Well, Shorto argues it was much more than just, another colonial settlement founded in 1624 and named a couple of years later.
Okay.
He calls it a cosmopolitan village right from the get-go. That's a really key distinction from the usual portrayal.
A cosmopolitan village. Tell me more. What did that look like?
He paints this, it's really vivid picture. Think gabled houses, busy workers loading ships down at the dock, streets buzzing with trade, maybe a bit of mischief, too.
Huh.
And people just chattering away in all sorts of different languages. It wasn't monolithic at all.
So pretty diverse even back then. How big was it?
By 1655, you had about 1,500 people just within New Amsterdam itself. But that was part of the wider New Netherland colony, which was maybe 9,000 strong. So a really vibrant hub for its time.
Wow, okay. That sounds like a seriously bustling place. What was driving all that activity? The economy?
Oh, absolutely. Trade was huge. It was a major center focused primarily on beaver fur and tobacco. Big business.
Beaver fur and tobacco, right.
And Peter Stuyvesant, the director general who arrived in 47, he was very actively trading with the local Native American peoples. That was completely central to their success.
But as Shorto points out, this vibrancy, this prosperity, it had a much darker side right from the start, didn't it? The beginning of slavery there.
Yes. That's a crucial and deeply troubling part of the story. The slave trade, unfortunately, began in New Amsterdam during this time.
When was that?
The first enslaved people arrived in 1659. Stuyvesant himself described them as 4 Negro boys and 1 little Negro girl.
That's chilling to hear in his own words.
It is, and it's something we absolutely have to acknowledge. It complicates that narrative of a purely tolerant, open city right from its foundations.
Definitely. Okay, now, this is where Shorto really starts to reshape things.
Yeah.
He argues that for ages, we've only seen New York's Dutch pass through English eyes.
Exactly. The English historians and the English rulers before them, they looked at the Dutch Republic, this tiny country that was incredibly wealthy with, quite a bit of envy.
Jealousy, basically.
Pretty much. And so in the English telling of history, the Dutch colony in America gets reduced to this semi-comic story, as Shorter puts it.
Semi-comic. How so?
Like, these cartoonish Dutchmen just bumbling around, not really knowing what they're doing, until the English gallantly arrive to sort of free them.
Right. The classic victor writing the history.
Precisely. It's a really biased view that just ignores the actual success and complexity of New Amsterdam.
Okay, so we have that biased image of conquest. But Shorto just turns that on its head, doesn't he? How does he describe what actually happened in 1664? That takeover. Without a fight.
Yeah, without a shot being fired. That's the incredible part. He calls it a merger, not a hostile takeover.
A merger.
It completely challenges how we usually think about these colonial power shifts. And if you zoom out, you have to remember, England and the Netherlands, these weren't just small players.
Yes, they were global empires.
Competing world empires, locked in this intense rivalry for wealth, for influence. So this wasn't just some local squabble. It was a strategic move on a much bigger chessboard.
Okay, that context is crucial. So, to understand why it was peaceful, why this merger happened, we need to look at England itself. What was going on there?
Oh, England was in absolute turmoil. While New Netherland was actually growing and kind of finding its feet, England was tearing itself apart in a civil war.
The English Civil War, right, between 1642 and 51.
Exactly, and it was brutal. Included the really shocking execution of their own king, Charles I, by his Puritan opponents in 1649.
Wow.
Yeah. Oliver Cromwell then establishes England as a republic. It was a period of massive upheaval for the English state.
And then things shifted again.
Yes. The monarchy was restored in 1660. Charles II came back to the throne, and he later cracked down pretty hard on those Puritan leaders who had overthrown his father.
So all that chaos back home must have affected how they dealt with the colonies.
Profoundly. It shaped their focus, definitely created a desire for more stability, more control, consolidation of power after all that disruption.
And how did this English situation connect with the Puritans who were already over here in North America?
Well, over in the English colony of New England, based mainly around Boston, the Puritans were very much dominant.
These were the ones who left England to practice their religion freely.
Exactly. They'd emigrated to get away from the Church of England's control. But Shorto describes them as, a strict, self-satisfied, theocratic sect.
Theocratic. Wow.
Yeah, and aggressively intolerant. He really pushes back against the idea that they were some kind of, intellectual precursors of the American Revolution.
Interesting. Why?
He points out quite sharply that, yes, they believed in freedom of religion, but really only for themselves, not so much for anyone who disagreed with them.
Okay, so you have this backdrop. England wanting control after chaos. Intolerant Puritans in New England. Which brings us back to Richard Nicolls. He was sent by the restored monarchy, right?
Yes. Nicolls was a loyal supporter of the Stuarts, King Charles II's family. His mission was clear: restore the crown's authority in North America and bring those Dutch territories under English rule.
So why then did he choose the peaceful route? Given his mission, given the context.
That's a great question, isn't it? Shorto suggests the English actually struggled to wrap their heads around New Amsterdam's success.
How so?
They couldn't really figure out how this place, with its confusing mix of languages and religions, actually worked so well.
Right.
Or how having a multi-ethnic population could possibly be a strength, a source of dynamism.
It didn't fit their model.
Not at all. Shorto puts it bluntly, it doesn't make sense and the English couldn't stand it. The Stuarts just saw New Amsterdam as this annoying obstacle to their own plans for colonial expansion.
Okay. And yet, Nicolls didn't just roll in with guns blazing, even though the Dutch fort wasn't really up to much, defensively speaking.
Right. And English forces were attacking Dutch targets quite violently elsewhere in the world. But Nicolls took a different tack here. He sent letters, he sent representatives, not bullets. It seems like a very conscious choice.
A calculated move. What about the people in New Amsterdam? How did they react?
Well, they were terrified of resisting. They knew the rules of war back then. If you resisted and lost, the enemy had the right to basically take everything, plunder.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Shorto captures their fear vividly, the fear that everything would be destroyed and plundered, and that, they and their families, over 1,500 people, would be thrown into the most abject poverty.
So that fear definitely pushed them towards accepting terms.
It was a huge factor. But crucially, Nicolls offered them acceptable terms. He gave them an alternative to ruin.
And Nicolls himself. Why was he perhaps more open to this?
Shorto's idea is that Nicolls, possibly from his own dealings with those very rigid Puritans in England, or maybe New England, had become, in Shorto's words, a lifelong advocate of tolerance.
Interesting. Not a modern liberal, obviously. But
No, definitely not. But maybe someone who valued stability and keeping the city functioning over just, ideological purity or brute force. He seemed genuinely prepared to compromise to keep the place intact.
And that willingness to compromise, combined with the Dutch pragmatism, led to this polder model outcome.
Exactly that. Shorto frames the result as this unique fusion of two rival European empires. The English took over politically, but they allowed the Dutch way of doing things, their commercial savvy, to continue. It was Dutch ingenuity under English rule.
So the polder model,
Mm-hmm.
that's the Dutch tradition of talking things out.
Precisely. It means you basically sit down and talk until everyone feels that they have at least got something of what they wanted. Negotiation, Compromise.
And that's how New Amsterdam became New York?
That's how. It was renamed, of course, in honor of the Duke of York, the king's brother, later King James II. But the people, their businesses, their diverse ways of life were largely allowed to continue. So New York ends up being this unique Dutch-English invention.
It's a fascinating story of compromise. But as we touched on earlier, this whole narrative, this transition, it's not all positive fusion, is it? There's a significant human cost, a real dark side we need to explore.
Absolutely. It's crucial we don't gloss over that. History is messy, and Shorto brings in figures like Margaret Hardenbrook.
Hoshi.
A really remarkable figure, actually. A German-descended woman, widowed young at 22, who then remarried into wealth. She became this major driving force behind the dynasty, heavily involved in trade. Including, tragically, the trade in enslaved Africans. A contemporary apparently called her an excessively greedy woman.
Wow. And her story was forgotten.
Largely, yes. Because under English law, when she married, all her property, her rights, legally fell under her husband's control. Her agency gets erased in the documents. It just starkly highlights how far things still had to go for women's rights, for emancipation.
A powerful example. And then there's the foundational injustice, the very land itself.
Yes, the purchase of Manhattan Island by the Dutch from the Lenape people for what? Knives and pans worth about 60 guilders.
Which Shorto calls
The greatest swindle in history. And it's hard to argue when you consider that land is now, among the most expensive real estate in the world. An unbelievable disparity.
And the slavery aspect didn't end with the English takeover, did it?
Not at all. Tragically, the system of slavery introduced by the Dutch just continued and even expanded under English rule and then later under American rule. New York actually became a major center of the slave trade.
That's horrifying.
It is. Shorto puts it very powerfully. If the idea of New York, forged in 1664, contained the liberating concept of tolerance, it also contained the seeds of intolerance and enough fertilizer to grow it.
Wow. Seeds of intolerance. That's a really stark image. It forces you to hold both ideas at once, the tolerance and the intolerance.
Exactly. It's complex, it's painful, but it's the truth of the city's founding.
So, okay, we have this merger, this Dutch-English invention, but it's deeply flawed, carrying these terrible injustices forward. What then is the lasting legacy? What does Shorto argue emerged from this complex origin story for New York and maybe for America?
Well, despite those undeniable, profound dark sides, Shorto argues that what happened in the summer of 1664 really has shaped the contours of American history and continues to shape it today.
How so? What specific element?
He believes that the English city, because of that merger, contained these vital elements brought to North America by the Dutch that changed the world. And the key one is pluralism.
Pluralism. The idea of a diverse society.
Exactly. The central idea that a society is made up of and can thrive with a mix of different kinds of people, different beliefs, different origins. He argues this got embedded into New York's founding DNA and from there into America's wider identity because of that Dutch influence surviving the English takeover.
That's a huge claim, linking that 1664 moment directly to American identity.
It is, and he even connects this historical fault line to politics today.
Really? How does he see that playing out now?
He suggests you can still kind of see American society as reflecting two fundamental, often conflicting movements or impulses that have deep historical roots.
Okay, what are they?
One, he suggests, feels sort of divinely justified, tends towards intolerance of difference, perhaps echoing that puritanical streak. And the other is based more on pluralism, seeing America as this place of freedom and opportunity for everyone, regardless of background.
And if he puts New York
firmly at the origin point, or at least a key early incubator of that second pluralistic movement. Thanks to that unique Dutch-English beginning, it's a really thought-provoking link between 1664 and, the divisions we still see today.
Absolutely. So zooming out after this whole deep dive,
yeah.
What's the big takeaway? What should we remember about New York's beginning?
Well, I think the main thing is that it just wasn't a simple conquest. That narrative is too easy, too clean. It was this really complex merger.
Right.
A unique blend of cultures, of empires, achieved remarkably through negotiation, through that Polder model, not just through fighting.
And this Dutch-English invention, as he calls it, laid down some fundamental tracks.
Yeah, it seems it did, including this really crucial, if imperfectly applied, idea of pluralism, an idea that continues to define New York and in many ways shapes the ongoing American experiment, but always alongside those darker legacies we discussed.
It really challenges you to look past the headlines of history, doesn't it?
Yeah.
To see the nuance.
Definitely. To look for the hidden compromises, the unexpected fusions that might be lurking beneath the surface of events.
Which does make you wonder, doesn't it?
Mm.
Thinking about this deep dive, what other big historical moments, the ones we think we know just as stories of winners and losers, might actually hide more complicated tales? Stories of, merger or cultural blending or surprising deals cut behind the scenes.
That's a great question.
How might digging into those complex origins change how we see our identities or even our conflicts around the world today? Something to think about.